In this video, we're going to talk about food, different animal diets, and nutrients that animals need in order to survive. Animals are heterotrophs, which means that they cannot make their own food. They have to acquire their nutrients and energy from eating other organic compounds. So taking in food actually provides two different important factors. So the first one is a source of energy. So you should have learned about cellular respiration in a previous biology class. And remember that in cellular respiration, cells are able to take organic compounds and break them down and make ATP. Remember that ATP is the energy molecule used by all cells in the body. Food also provides molecular building blocks for organic compounds. So you can see this list here of nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and polysaccharides. And these are all examples of macromolecules. And macro just means big. So these are big molecules. They're also sometimes called biomolecules because essentially the organic part of all living things are made out of these four types of molecules. They are also often referred to as polymers, although lipids are an exception to that. And they are made up of monomers. And we're going to talk about these different macromolecules and their monomers and what they're used for on the following slides. But it's important to note that these polymers can be broken down into their monomers, and that is what happens during digestion. And this is a catabolic process. The monomers can then be put back together to make additional or different polymers, and this would be an anabolic reaction. So if you've ever heard the saying that you are what you eat, that is literally true, because when you take in carbohydrates and nucleic acids and proteins and lipids, your bodies break them down into their smaller parts and then put them back together, but maybe in a different way in order to make up the proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids that make up you. So first, let's talk about the nucleic acids. And remember that this is a macromolecule. That is also a polymer. And the monomers that make up nucleic acids are called nucleotides. And there are different nucleotides involved. Well, first of all, let's talk about the nucleic acids. So nucleic acids include things like DNA and RNA. And then the nucleotides include things like adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. And notice that this is a two-way arrow here. So animals can take in food, and when you ingest food, you're ingesting DNA because all living organisms have DNA in their cells. So your body is taking those nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, breaking them down into their nucleotides. And then when it's time for your body to make copies of your DNA, it has this pool of nucleotides that it can put together in order to make a new strand of DNA or to make RNA. So you can see in this picture here, so this is the double helix of DNA, and it's showing these nucleotides. So each one of these is a pair, a base pair, and just one of them, like here's an adenine, is a single nucleotide. And if we were to take this nucleotide out and take a look at it bigger, this is what it would look like. Now let's take a look at proteins. And proteins are probably the most diverse group of macromolecules in the body. They do a lot of different things for living organisms. And so a protein is a polymer. It's a macromolecule. I'll just put MM for macromolecule. And it's made up of these monomers known as amino acids. And there are actually 20 different kinds of amino acids. And there are, billions of different proteins. So remember that proteins can be involved in things like transport across the cell membrane. They can also transport things in the blood. They can be used to extract energy in the form of ATP. They can be structural. For example, your muscles are made up of actin and myosin, which are proteins that allow your muscles to contract. They can be receptors, et cetera, et cetera. So they can do a lot of different things for the body. Oh, they can be hormones too. I forgot to mention that, hormones. So you can see here, so this is an intermediate filament, and this is something that makes up the cytoskeleton in your cells. And so this is going to be the protein, which is the macromolecule, it's the polymer. And so this polypeptide, this is essentially a protein that has been kind of unwound. And each one of these is an amino acid. So you can see that a protein is made up of polypeptides that they do get folded and kinked into a three-dimensional structure. But if you were to unkink them or unfold them, you would see just this long chain of monomers known as amino acids. And each one of these amino acids has a structure kind of similar to this one, although this area right here might change. So you might actually have a chain of carbons with some hydrogens. You might have some rings. It might look like different things, but the basic molecular formula of an amino acid is what you're seeing here. You'll also notice that proteins have nitrogen in them. And so proteins are a major source of nitrogen in an animal's diet. Next, we'll talk about lipids, and lipids kind of don't follow the rule of the other macromolecules. So they're not technically a polymer, but they are still a macromolecule, and they are still made up of some smaller molecules that aren't technically monomers, but they kind of fulfill that role. Now, there are a lot of different types of lipids, but the one that we're showing specifically on this picture here are going to be triglycerides. And these are the lipids that are what you store in your fat tissue. So it's stored energy, and your body can break bonds in order to extract energy in the form of ATP. So lipids get broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. And more specifically, there are 3 fatty acids, which is where the tri in triglycerides comes from. So you can see here that these are adipose tissue cells here, so adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is just full of fat. So this globule in here is just a whole bunch of triglycerides. And this triglyceride, essentially, this part of the molecule is going to be the glycerol. And then these are the fatty acids. And if we were to take a look at just one of these fatty acids, it looks something kind of like this. Now, lipids are needed for a lot of different purposes in the body, but one reason is they are needed to absorb lipid-soluble vitamins. So there are some vitamins that have to be essentially dissolved in fats in order to be absorbed across the intestines. Lipids are also needed in order to make lipid-based hormones, which are called steroids. So these are going to be things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol. These are just some examples. Lipids are also the most efficient way for our cells in our body to store energy. So 1 gram of fat equals 9 calories. And a calorie is just a measurement of energy. So more calories means more energy. Now, for proteins and carbohydrates, 1 gram of those macromolecules only have 4 calories associated with them. And so it's much more efficient. You get more than twice as much energy stored in the same amount of weight as you would if you were storing it as protein or carbohydrates. And last but not least, we have our polysaccharides, which are also known as complex carbohydrates. And these polysaccharides, these are the macromolecules, the polymer, like we've talked about on the other slides. And then monosaccharides are going to be the monomers. So you can see in this picture down here, so we've got starch, and starch is a polysaccharide. And it is made up of these individual monosaccharides, which are the monomers that are bonded together. So each one of these little hexagons is a monosaccharide bonded to more monosaccharides. So if we were to take just one of these and look at its structure, it would look something kind of like this. And carbohydrates play a couple of different roles in the body. They are the primary source of carbon, and that carbon is needed in order to make other organic compounds. Excess carbohydrates get stored as glycogen, and glycogen is another polysaccharide. It's similar to starch, but it's different a little bit in structure. So you can see this picture here. You can see that each one of these little hexagons is a monosaccharide. And then when they're all kind of bonded together, they form this polysaccharide known as glycogen. And so it's a little bit different in how the monosaccharides are arranged. So it's a little bit different from starch. And this glycogen is primarily stored in the liver, although some of it is also stored in the muscles. And this is helpful because let's say you go a long period of time without eating any food. Well, your body can essentially tap into the stored glycogen as kind of a quick energy source. So it can take that glycogen, break it down into monosaccharides, and then break down those monosaccharides using cellular respiration to make ATP. And this is a quicker process than breaking down lipids or proteins. So this is going to be kind of the first store of energy that is used up as your body also works on breaking down lipids and then eventually proteins. Now, if there is excess glycogen, so there's only a certain amount of glycogen that your body can and will store. So excess glycogen actually gets converted to lipids. And these are the fats that are stored underneath your skin. So subcutaneously means just under the skin. So if you eat excess carbs, you can get excess fat because your body converts the carbohydrates, the glycogen, into fat. And remember that fat can store more than twice as much energy per gram than a carbohydrate can. So it's actually more efficient to store it as fat because you get more energy stored per unit of weight. Animal bodies can make some of the nutrients that they need, but there are these essential nutrients, and these are nutrients that cannot be made in the body, so they must be obtained through food. And some examples of these essential nutrients include fatty acids, some amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. And we'll talk about these on the following slides. So, one reason why we need to ingest fatty acids is to make phospholipids. So, if you recall, the cell membrane, which is being shown down here, the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So, basically, two layers of these phospholipids. And so, each one of these is a single phospholipid. And the head is made up of a phosphate group, but the tails are lipids. And more specific, these lipid or fatty acid tails are omega-3 alpha linolenic acid and omega-6 linolenic acid. And so these are the fatty acids that are needed in order to make the fatty acid tails of the phospholipids that make up our cell membranes. I mentioned that some amino acids are essential, meaning that they have to be acquired in the diet. So there are 22 total amino acids in living organisms, and about half of them have to be obtained from food. And so you can see this list here of amino acids that must be consumed. And so consumed means eaten or taken in by food. So our cells, our bodies, do not have the ability to make these amino acids, so we have to get them from our diet. The ones on the right side are ones that our body can make. Animals also have to take in vitamins through their diet, and vitamins act as coenzymes. And a coenzyme is just something that essentially helps an enzyme do its job. So it's an enzyme helper. And remember that enzymes are essentially catalyzing all the chemical reactions in our bodies. And so if you have a deficiency in a vitamin, it can actually affect the activity of the enzymes in your bodies. It can cause problems. So it can lead to different symptoms or even death. So let's talk about some examples. I didn't list all the vitamins here, but here are some examples of vitamins and what they do. So there are several different types of B vitamins, and in general, they are involved in metabolism. So remember that metabolism are just the chemical reactions. Involved in breaking down and making molecules and extracting energy to make ATP. Vitamin B9, so this is a specific B vitamin, is also known as folic acid. And it is especially important for neurological development, especially in fetuses. So typically pregnant women will take prenatal vitamins that have a lot of folic acid in them. If a woman is pregnant and her folic acid levels are low, it can lead to neurological developmental abnormalities in the baby, including spina bifida. Vitamin C is also known as ascorbic acid, and it helps to stimulate and support the immune system. Vitamin A is also known as retinol, and it helps to strengthen bones and teeth. It contributes to the health of your skin and also eyesight. It helps to keep your eyes healthy. Vitamin D is needed for calcium absorption. So if you eat calcium, you typically want to have some vitamin D involved as well. And if you take a calcium supplement, you'll notice that most calcium supplements are actually sold as a calcium and vitamin D supplement. And that's because you can eat all the calcium in the world, but if you don't have any vitamin D, your body isn't going to absorb it and be able to use it. You also need vitamin D and calcium for blood clotting, to help strengthen your bones, and for things like muscle contractions in your heart. Vitamin E is also known as tocopherol, and it helps to support the immune system and prevent cellular damage. And vitamin K is also known as phyloquinone, which is involved in blood clotting. Minerals are also needed in a well-rounded diet, and minerals act as cofactors, and these are also enzyme helpers. The main difference between a coenzyme and a cofactor is that these are inorganic, whereas the vitamins that we talked about on the previous slide are organic. So that's what makes them coenzymes versus cofactors. And I meant to talk about this picture on the previous page, but we'll talk about it now. You can see how we've got our enzyme here in gray, and we've got the active site where the substrate should fit right here. But what happens, the activator, and this activator can either be the coenzyme, so the vitamin, or a cofactor, a mineral. It binds to a secondary site, which when it binds there, it changes the shape of the active site so the substrate can now bind. So you can imagine if you were to be deficient in vitamins and minerals, you would not have this activator, and so you would not be able to change the active site, and your enzymes would essentially stop working. Some examples of minerals that are essential nutrients are things like calcium, which is needed for muscle contractions and neuron function, also to strengthen the bones. Iodine is needed to make thyroid hormones. One reason why salt is often fortified with iodine is to help people get more iodine into their body through their diet. Prior to having iodized salt, there were a lot of problems with people developing something called a goiter. And a goiter is basically a swollen throat. That's where the thyroid gland is. So the thyroid gland would get bigger because it wasn't able to make the hormones because it was deficient in iodine. So they started adding iodine to table salt, and that essentially gave everyone an iodine supplement that helped to prevent that hypothyroidism goiter from happening. Iron is needed to make hemoglobin. Potassium and sodium are both needed for muscle and nerve function. And if you recall the nervous system, we talked about how potassium and sodium are needed to maintain the resting membrane potential and then needed for an action potential to occur.